So Astro, you just gave a talk here at our Solid conference entitled Moonshots for the Physical World, about your work with Google X. It seemed to me there's some irony in that the original moonshot was a moonshot for the physical world. Can you talk a little bit about that? We're in such a software world for so long, the hardware and the physical world are coming back.
Yeah, well, that was the point of the title of the talk, was to highlight the reality that moonshots, at least as we mean them, don't just mean doing what I'm excited about doing. Somebody told me recently that they're working on better frozen yogurt for the cafes at Google, and this is their moonshot. And I didn't want to discourage them, but what I was thinking was, that's really not what we mean by a moonshot.
Right.
And I guess a moonshot isn't required to have a physical aspect to it, but solving really big problems in the world tends to require some kind of contact with the physical world that's non-trivial.
Right, and also that notion, I mean, people who didn't grow up then, that seemed impossible. You know, when they set out to go land on the moon, you know, we were still just barely out of the propeller plane age. You know, that was so far ahead of what was possible, and it pushed so much learning. And I think that to me is, you know, when I think moonshot, it's like something that really brings out capabilities that we didn't know we have.
Yeah, and a way of answering the question, what is it that Google X works on, would be to say, we only work on those things that both meet the criteria, they look impossible, and that we think we've seen a perspective from which they might not be. And of course, they have to matter too.
Right. Yes, stuff that matters, absolutely. So can you kind of give us a list of some of the hot projects that you're working on?
Sure. So there are some projects that grew up inside of Google X but have since graduated. So those would be things like the Massive Neural Network project, which is now embedded in the main part of Google and servicing many of the different aspects of how Google functions today. Or Google Glass, which grew up inside Google X but was graduated about 6 months ago to head towards productization in Tony Fidel's world. Or there's a standalone business in the construction and architecture space called Flux that originally came out of Google X. But then there are things that are still inside of Google X today, things like the self-driving cars, the contact lenses for measuring things about people's bodies while you're wearing the contact lens, the stratospheric balloon project, Project Loon, Makani, the energy kite, the airborne wind turbine project, are, I think, reasonably well-known examples of the kinds of things that we're working on. We just, for example, announced yesterday another one in the life sciences space, working on doing what people have tried, including myself, for several decades to do, which is to get medical grade information in a wearable body monitor. And I would hardly say that we're done, but I think we have taken at least an interesting step past what has been done before, and that's a very exciting road. And so those are the kinds of things that we try to take on.
So, you know, a couple of those examples that you brought up remind me of a couple of other things about the original moonshot. And that was, it became a race. And clearly self-driving cars have kicked off that kind of race where all the automakers now are, you know, you really changed the way people thought about that as something that was possible. And so now there are more people trying to do it. I think that's also true with sort of the high altitude Wi-Fi. Are any of the other moonshots sort of kicking off that kind of competitive activity where other people are going, whoa, we got to do this too?
I'm not going to say that any of them have necessarily kicked that off, but another one that we've been working on for many years, and that several years after we started working on it has become a hot topic, is unmanned aerial vehicles for package delivery. So now, you know, Amazon and DHL and others are also working in that same space, but that's something that we've been working on for quite a few years.
But do you think that that sort of competitive dynamic is a good thing for moonshots?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would be much more worried if we were working on something and nobody seemed excited enough to try to do it also.
Yeah.
We truly want to make the problem go away. And if we truly want to make the problem go away, well, I'm sure it would be a little bit disappointing not to produce the best solution. That is very secondary to the problem going away in our minds. So if someone can make a better self-driving car than we can, good for them, good for the world, seriously.
So you said something really important here, which is make the problem go away. And the reason that resonates with me is that there's been a lot of discussion as a result of the self-driving car and other sort of possible futures, whether it's AI in the workplace or robots, the robots are going to take our jobs. This is, and the hollowing out of the economy is actually due to technology. And I think that's a fairly pernicious meme. I think the hollowing out of the economy is actually driven by a bunch of financial decisions made on Wall Street, much more than by technology. But I do think that there's something really, really interesting here when we think about big problems. I think we actually typically create new work because, yes, let's just imagine a world where there are self-driving cars and taxi drivers and even Uber drivers and truck drivers are out of work. There's been a lot of scare stories about that, and yet it seems to me that once we have that technology, we can start to say, well, what new problems are there that we can solve with that technology?
Yes, as you point out, sadly, the world is in no danger of running out of problems to work on.
Right.
We have more than enough problems to keep us busy for hundreds of years. But even putting aside...
But I think that's super important in this discussion. The policymakers, I think, need to stop talking about creating jobs, and they need to start talking about what is the work that we need to do in the world. Because if you do that work, you do create jobs. I was struck by this actually when I went to Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, and there was this, all this. He was really into scientific agriculture, as was Thomas Jefferson, and he had this vision that America could feed the world, and there was that economic vision of, wow, there is something that needs doing. And I kind of feel like that one of the things I love about Google X is it is driven by solving problems. And those problems actually often do create new opportunities for work.
And I completely agree with you about the problems. In addition, when you look at the history of technology and its introduction and what happened in society afterwards, technology has functioned in every case in the past as a lever for the human mind or for the human body. So things like the introduction of spreadsheets destroyed the business, the profession of bookkeeping. But because we trained people, society trained people, they became accountants. They became analysts. And as many jobs as were lost were created, and more work, more productivity was created in the process. The bulldozer took away, in a very analogous way, a lot of jobs from people who were digging with shovels. But because we trained them to do things like build bulldozers, drive bulldozers, maintain the bulldozers, it wasn't a net loss for the economy. I believe that the failure mode we are currently in, to the extent that there's a failure mode, is not the introduction of new technologies, but the failure of our society to train the young people of the world so that they will be prepared to use these more and more sophisticated levers.
Yeah, that's right. And not just the training of the people, but also the social organization that uses the people.
Absolutely.
It's very, very interesting. I know that Sebastian Thrun with Udacity has made a deal with AT&T to retrain their workers. And here's this thing: we have new capabilities for on-demand education that actually make it easier to retarget people. Right. I was talking also with Stefan Casriel at Upwork, formerly Odesk Elance, about the velocity of job change there and their ability to measure and manage. We have all these amazing new technologies to find out, what's in demand, and then to figure out how do we train people to do it. Actually, I learned just the other day about this fascinating company called Catalyst IT Services based in Baltimore. It's actually an outgrowth of another company which was called Pegged, which does basically analysis of what skills are required to do various jobs. And they ended up deciding they would go after IT services directly. And they're basically, they hire like 15 out of 1,000 people because they do this very powerful skills assessment and then training. But apparently it's, they're getting people out of Pizza Hut and placing them in IT jobs after training. This is amazing, upskilling of workers by applying technology to figure out if they have the capabilities, and then using technology to train them, and then finding them
right, and that's the virtuous cycle that technology makes possible.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of moving back to this notion of the real world, in your talk today, you were discussing a little bit what you've learned from Project Loon, but also how you learned it. And you made the point that the way that you do the process can be as important as what you actually get out of it. So maybe you could talk about the learning process for hardware.
Yeah, so the point I was trying to make today was, in previous talks that I've given, I've focused on the idea of failure being the engine for innovation, not being afraid of failure, but seeing it as a learning opportunity, and the value of getting out into the world and testing things earlier rather than later. But that actually doesn't answer the question, what should you do first? Mm-hmm. So what I tried to talk about more today was, in a little bit more detail, the process of when can you put something off for several years, just punt it. And is that the smart thing to punt or not? So for example, if you can put something off for several years in a big hard project, and the thing that you're putting off is the thing which is most likely in the end to be the reason the whole project doesn't work, it was a horrible idea to put it off. Even if you can sort of put it off and look like you're making progress, it's a ladder to the moon. It's exactly the wrong thing to do. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you're very confident that it's just hard work and that you're not going to learn at the end that it's your Achilles heel, and you have to be intellectually honest with yourselves about that, then by all means do find some way to put in a hack if necessary, but put it off as long as possible, because you're not going to learn anything by doing it. And so I was trying.
There's also the possibility that someone else will make progress there.
Sure, exactly. But let me give you an example that I didn't use in the talk today. I do this frequently with teams where I say, make me the list of the 20 things that you think we should do in order. And they'll come up with their list. And then I say, okay, reorder that list relative to what you think will cause the most learning. Mm-hmm. And invariably, it's a different list. Mm-hmm. And then I say, let's just do the top 2 things on your second list, on the learning list. Mm-hmm. And without fail, what happens is that so much has been learned after those first 2 things have happened.
The rest of the list
that we have to totally remake the list. Mm-hmm. And then I say to the group, that's why we don't do the first list.
That's a really great. That's a really great lesson. Wow, I want to digest that for a while. That's great.
So, I gave an example today of the fact that the balloon spins freely on its axis, mm-hmm. and I think it's a good example for Project Loon of we can't let it just rotate with the wind, because ultimately we need our photovoltaics to point at the sun so we can get full power. We can't just occasionally get a little drive-by, sun. And we need to collimate the conversations, these RF links between the balloons, and they have to be pointed at each other very carefully. That doesn't work if they're just sort of freely rotating. We knew that to be the case. It's not trivial to let this huge thing the size of the house freely rotate in the stratosphere while the thing under it doesn't move, because you have to pass power and data through something that can't have any wires on it. And it's super cold and there's almost no air up there, and yet we managed to put it off for several years and just cherry-picked other things that we could learn, because there were enough ways we could have failed without doing that. Mm-hmm. And I think thinking through as carefully as possible, what can we put off, how long can we put it off, how well can we decouple different sub-teams in the moonshot we're trying to take. Mm-hmm. That, in a sense, is the moonshot itself.
Yeah. Can you talk about the connection between that approach you just described and Google's OKR process? Because it seems to me that there's at least a common thread here of identifying that thing that is hard that you are really committing to doing. The OKRs doesn't really necessarily focus on learning, but it does seem that it's a very, very goal-directed activity that cascades through time.
It does, and what I like about the OKR process at Google, which is objective and key results,
right,
is that the average score that we give ourselves across all of Google, if you look at all of our scores, is on the order of 70%. And I think that's incredibly healthy. It doesn't make sense for us to, if we're shooting so high that we never get anything done, it's totally demoralizing.
Yeah.
And if we're shooting low enough that we always get it done, we definitely could have pushed ourselves harder.
Yeah, well, that's why I think I always hated the sort of management by objectives, which a lot of people sort of actually just translate to the new language of OKRs, and that was just the system by which managers rewarded themselves for what they knew they could do.
What they'd already done in many cases, and just hadn't mentioned
versus really kind of pushing, wait, this is something really important.
So what we've done
but it's also,
at Google
it has
X,
that order of ordering things in importance, which is not necessarily just, well, this is the biggest thing, so therefore that goes first. It's no, this is the critical thing, and how do you have the intelligence to identify that thing which is most critical, and as you said, that will provide the most learning.
Right, so using that analogy, in many ways, Google X is sort of just a distillation of the DNA of Google, just like a hothouse for it. And I think OKRs is a good example. At Google X, we do audacious goals. And you could think of them as OKRs, but by calling them audacious goals, these are quarterly goals.
Yeah.
Because within a quarter, we tend to learn that what we were doing was the wrong thing anyway. Even on a project that continues to move forward. Our metrics change. We realize it was the wrong way to talk about what success counted as, all kinds of things. But every quarter, for the team to say, this is this crazy thing we're going to try to get done by this quarter. And I think in the history of Google X, we're probably batting something like 20%, not even, I bet, complete accomplishment of those goals. I think it's well below 20%.
I like that word.
And it doesn't demoralize them because they understand that they're challenging themselves to do something where there's a pride between the teams, not in so much in whether they accomplish it or not, but in setting a goal which is so exciting, so seemingly impossible, that almost is more bragging rights than whether they scored 50% or 30% afterwards on it.
I think that concept of audaciousness is really critical. At O'Reilly, we're trying to build a process like this, and Laura Baldwin calls them OMGs as a way to kind of get that across. It's like you want to have that OMG response to succeeding.
Exactly.
And I think I think there's a lot to learn from pushing to do really hard things, and I think we as a society need more moonshots. And kind of bringing it back around to the big policy of how are we going to create the future we want. There has to be that sense that we can tackle and succeed at seemingly impossible things, rather than, oh my God, the future is just going to be shitty.
Right, and one of the reasons that I do some public speaking is because I want to encourage people to feel like that. There's a sense that never gets fully articulated, but it's clearly out there, that being that audacious is somebody else's job and somebody else's opportunity. That the big companies tend to act like, well, we don't take risk. We don't do really weird stuff that's outside of our box by 100 miles. That's what little companies do. They have nothing to lose. The little companies are like, well, that's not us. The big companies should do it because they've got all the money. We don't have the money to do something hard and weird. The governments think, well, we did that 50 years ago maybe when it was the actual moonshot, but we just don't have the money or the stick-to-itiveness to do those kind of things anymore. Academia thinks that they're supposed to write the papers about it but not actually build anything.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks it's not their job, and I think it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah,
I think everyone has it as their job and everyone has it as their opportunity. I think the pace of problems is picking up in the world. And we owe it to each other and to ourselves to pick up the pace of solving them too. And that's going to require enthusiasm and audaciousness, not panic, but just a sense that we can get out of the incrementalism that sometimes tends to take over how problems get solved.
That's great. You know, this is really opening up another can of worms, but you mentioned government, and you know, for a long time, you know, government really understood that one of its roles was, in fact, to deal with market failure, to tackle problems that the market was just not going to tackle. And, you know, there are still pockets where that happens. You know, but if you look at the history of our industry, you know, the original, you know, work on computing funded by the government, you know, original work on the internet funded by the government. And in fact, it's still going on, but people don't really give the government credit because there's so much anti-government. You know, all the work on robotics and, you know, what came
directly out of DARPA.
Exactly. You know, so I guess I want to just put in a plug for the government is still doing it. We need to recognize and encourage and kind of reward government for doing more of that. As opposed to, well, those guys can't do anything. Well, guess what? They did, in fact, kick off this huge technological innovation in self-driving cars and robotics with the DARPA challenges, and they've done amazing things in you know, like the Human Genome Project. So I want to hear it for our collective will to do big things, not just belonging to companies like Google.
Absolutely. Almost everything we're working on has a rich history of funded basic science. So the self-driving cars, as you were just alluding to, came directly out of work from DARPA and the DARPA Grand Challenge. Things like a lot of the original balloon science that we're now standing on the shoulders of, as it were, came out of the US military and other government agencies that were interested in learning things like about the weather, for example. So, you know, we're, I hope, adding some value in each of these areas, but we're not starting from like raw materials and zero learning in any of these cases. I think there is a gap that Google X and others can help fill between the basic science and sort of straightforward commercialization, but no amount of filling in that gap could ever replace the funding that has to go on for basic science where you don't yet have a clear goal. Because if you don't have that, you know, there's a certain kind of, you know, 2 standard deviation kind of progress that can be made in straightforward commercialization, maybe 4 standard deviation kind of progress that can be made in a Google X-like environment. But the 6 standard deviation stuff that happens very rarely, but super critically in academia, it's not going to happen unless people have the freedom to be wrong almost all of the time and to look at things that are even more unlikely than the things that Google X works on.
That's great. All right, I think that's a good place to wrap.
Wonderful. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.